We would like to welcome you to today's event, Beyond the Bookshelf, My Heart is Bound Up with Them, How Carlos Montezuma Became the Voice of a Generation with David Martinez. Please share your questions in chat or Q&A with the option for everyone. Questions will be addressed from the chat and Q&A. Thank you for coming, and I will now pass the presentation to Joyce Martin, who will share the ASU Library Indigenous Land Acknowledgement and introduce our panelists.
Hello and welcome everyone. I'm Joyce Martin, librarian and ASU Library Social Sciences Division Head. I'm delighted to open this Beyond the Bookshelf event with our ASU Library Indigenous Land Acknowledgement. The ASU Library acknowledges the 23 Native nations that have inhabited this land for centuries. Arizona State University's 4 campuses are located in the Salt River Valley on ancestral territories of Indigenous peoples, including the Akimel O'odham and Peepash Indian communities, whose care and keeping of these lands allows us to be here today. ASU Library acknowledges the sovereignty of these nations and seeks to foster an environment of success and possibility for Native American students and patrons. We are advocates for the incorporation of Indigenous knowledge systems and research methodologies within contemporary library practice. ASU Library welcomes members of the Akimel O'odham and Peepash and all Native nations to the library. I also have the pleasure of introducing our panel today for ASU Library Beyond the Bookshelf, featuring Dr. David Martinez, the author of the book, My Heart is Bound Up with Them, How Carlos Montezuma Became a Voice of a Generation. He will be in conversation with Brad Vogus, a librarian in the Social Science Division of ASU Library, and Vina Begay, librarian in the Labriola National American Indian Data Center of ASU Library. We'll be sharing additional information regarding our archives and the Labriola Center, as well as assisting with community questions. Dr. David Martinez, Professor of American Indian Studies and Transborder Studies, is the author of several books and is also the director and founder of the Institute for Transborder Indigenous Nations, which is housed in the School of Transborder Studies, where it focuses on Indigenous nations impacted by the U.S.-Mexico border. Brad Vogus is an Associate Liaison Librarian in the Engagement and Learning Directorate at the ASU Library. He is the coordinator of the Federal Depository Library located at the Fletcher Library on the ASU West Valley campus. And Vina Begay is an assistant librarian and the archivist for Labriola National American Indian Data Center. She oversees Labriola's library and archives collection. Labriola is located at ASU Tempe and ASU West Valley campus. Take it away, Brad.
Thanks, Joyce. And thank you, Dr. Martinez, again for being here. We are very happy to have you. Got a copy of your book here. And we've all had a chance to read it. And I'd like to start with talking about your writing process for this book. How did it happen? Was this something that you've always wanted to write about? What was the kind of the intellectual journey that you had to discover the information that came out in this book?
Well, my relationship to Carlos Montezuma goes back at least 20 years, specifically to when I did a one-year fellowship at the Newberry. So this is 2003, 2004. So I was a then young assistant professor at the University of Minnesota, and I was developing my career as an American Indian Studies scholar. And so I had taken an interest, or developed an interest in Native intellectual history. And I was particularly interested in figures that appeared during the Progressive Era, so 1880s, 1920s. So Montezuma was a prominent part of this generation. And what I soon learned reading about this man, his work and legacy, is that in his advocacy work, when he was defending land and water rights on behalf of his home community at Fort McDowell, that there was this additional chapter in his Arizona life where he defended land and water rights for the O'odham, most importantly up in Salt River, but also in Gila River as well. And he was also an influence, huge influence on the Thon O'odham farther to the south. And so it was on that basis, this man having done work for my tribe in Gila River, that inspired this 20 some odd year journey where I've been reading, writing, and teaching about Carlos Montezuma and what he did on behalf of Native communities. So, however, when I started my work on Montezuma back in 03, 04, I thought at most that he would be a chapter in a much larger project. There was so much to write about when it comes to this progressive era of Native intellectuals. And I did produce a paper in 2013 that was about that particular relationship that I mentioned between him, Montezuma, and my community. And because of that publication, because I'm longtime friends with Joyce, when she initiated her project, um, wanting to digitize the Carlos Montezuma Archives collection, that she invited me on board. And so it's one of these things where in my effort to produce something publishable regarding this collection, that I dove into all of the boxes, found all of these letters, and I started transcribing them. And then because I was transcribing them, it evolved into this paper that I was planning to write about, specifically about the collection. However, long story short, I was so interested, fascinated, and inspired by this correspondence that Montezuma received from his family at home that this paper that, this paper that I was writing just suddenly started to grow and grow and grow and grow and grow. So what was supposed to be a 30-page paper suddenly developed into this 200-page book. And so that's really how this book came about. I just did so much writing because I was just so inspired by what I was learning that before I knew it, I had a major manuscript so I did not intend to write this book. It just happened.
Right. And so this, I mean, and it's what's unique about this book is the perspective. It's showing his correspondence to people on the reservation, his family, later in his life. And for those that are not familiar with Carlos Montezuma and his early life that led to where your book is, he would tell his story a lot when in Wasaja, his newsletter and speeches. Could you kind of tell his early life until this is, his synopsis? Sure. It's a long story, but yeah.
I'll try to be succinct. I mean, it's quite the epic, but the highlights of his early life consist of him being born and raised in the Yavapai community, which is up along the Verde River, just north of my community. And during the 1860s, of course, Arizona, even though it was technically a territory, because of the sparse occupation in the region, this is still pretty much Indian land, right? And so there was a lot of strife, conflict that was erupting because the United States was moving in, and it intensified the rivalry between my community and the Yavapai community. The all of them historically regarded the Yavapai and Apache, as our rivals, and we called them O'odham. It's our word for enemy. they have their own word for us that also means enemy, of course. So what happened is that because the United States was engaged on this campaign against the Apaches, which included the Yavapai, the U.S. Army was enlisting people from my community to serve as scouts. And this was under the auspices of the 1866 Army Reorganization Act. Anybody who knows about the Indian Scouts, they know about that legislation because that's what authorized the Army to create these Indian scouting units. And so down here, that included some scouts from my community who were deployed into Apache country to conduct raids, abduct people, or arrest them, to play a role in the Army's agenda. So that's when Montezuma's village, his family, was targeted by one of these raids. So a group of my ancestors, raided his village. They wreaked havoc, and sad to say, there were fatalities. But among the survivors was this little boy, Wasaja, who was taken by these Pima Scouts, and he was sold to an itinerant Italian photographer, Carlo Gentile, in the town of Florence. And so it's because of Gentile's intervention, if you will, that Montezuma embarked on this journey back east. He wound up in New York, first of all, and then he was adopted by a different family that moved him to Chicago, which is where he grew up. In the book, of course, I talk about those early episodes, not only because he talked about them a lot, and he regarded that story, that life-transforming experience as informing his political agenda, his political identity.
Right.
I also talk about it in terms of not only colonization. I mean, my ancestors were working for the Army, right? That's the reason why they were out there. But also the trauma that he must have undergone as a child, which Montezuma never reflected on. I mean, I read a lot of his writings, of course, the correspondence, and there was never any reference on his part or others that he, suffered nightmares, or suffered any of the effects that you might expect or would expect from that kind of this kind of tragic event. I mean, he lost his parents.
Abduction, yeah.
And so what that may mean in terms of how he handled it is just open to speculation, but there's no way he wasn't traumatized. And I would say that it's due to that trauma that he carried with him that was the real motivation for why Montezuma fought so hard against the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Because technically, Indians during that time that he was abducted were under the auspices of Indian Affairs.
Right. And he did. I honestly didn't know his full story either. Before reading, so I've done some homework, and I was amazed that after the events that he went through as a young boy, then going to the University of Illinois at 14. He was 14 years old when he enrolled at the University of Illinois. Graduated when he was 18. Class president was just incredible. And then along with that, so in this book, like I said, it's later in his life, and so let's move to his political advocacy, and mostly against the Bureau of Indian Affairs. I've got a copy here, of the 1917 report of the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, Cato Sells, and the official policy, one of the things that he says in this, during the last 4 years, the administration of Indian Affairs has been largely concentrated on the following fundamental activities. And among those, he says, the health condition of Indians, the improvement of their industrial conditions, the further development of vocational training in the schools, and the protection of the Indians' property. So that's the official word, which we know is not true. And from reading the correspondence and the correspondence that Carlos Montezuma had with his actual family that were in the reservation, that were living this, that would tell you, no, that's not what's happening. That's not what the Bureau of Indian Affairs is doing. So can you expand on that, on the Bureau of Indian Affairs and his connection to the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and then his fight against them later in his life, which was super, super important.
Right. Well, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, over its entire existence, has gone through various stages in its history. And so during this particular epoch in which Montezuma was active, so in particular the 1910s into the early 1920s, this was a time when Indian reservations were dominated by local superintendents, what we call the Indian agents. And so every reservation had an Indian agent that was in charge of that particular group, that particular reservation. Now, bear in mind that Indian people across the board in the United States did not have citizenship rights. There were people who struggled their way into citizenship through the 1887 General Allotment Act. That's a separate narrative. But in general, if you were an Indian in the United States during Montezuma's time, you were not a citizen of the United States. Therefore, you did not have any rights under the Constitution, period. So that meant that your civil liberties and your human rights, were left to the discretion of the people who were in control of you. So because the Indian office had this mandate from Congress, to civilize Indian people, its wards, and turn them into productive members of United States society, Indian agents and the people who worked for them, had the authority to do whatever they saw fit in order to drive the Indian out of the Indian and make way for American style values, whether it's going to church, working for an hourly wage, working for a profit. In the case of my community, we're always farmers. They're still farmers. But what changed during this generation is that we're not growing food for sustaining ourselves or for ceremony or for trading with our friends. We have to grow food. Well, we have to grow crops for the open market. So we're forced to enter this competitive economy where the only way to pay for our needs is we have to learn how to earn a living, which is an alien concept. So because the Indian office was charged with civilizing us, they didn't hesitate, to be abusive. And they could be abusive with impunity. So you give anybody, that kind of power over any group of people, and they know that they're not going to get in trouble for the things that they do, no matter what. That's a temptation that, let's say certain types of people, are just going to respond to with a lot of hostility. And so that happened regularly on the reservations out here. And so it was because of Montezuma's connection with his relatives back home that he found out from them what the abuses were. And so his struggle against the Indian Bureau, it was a personal one.
Right. And along with that, I mentioned earlier his newsletter, which he used his original name. That was the. Can you describe the importance of that and how that happened and how that was used among many different tribes?
Well, one of the unfortunate consequences of his abduction and being forcibly removed to New York and Chicago is that he lost his language. But fortunately, he didn't lose his name. And it was the name that his family back home called him because that's who he really is. And so while Montezuma, in many regards, not the least of which was becoming a medical doctor, adapted successfully into mainstream white society. At the same time, no matter how far from home you might be, no matter how much you adapt to the modern world around you, even going to medical school and becoming a successful doctor, that you can't underestimate the power of kinship, because it's going to be your maternal family that's the source of who you really are. And so when it comes to Montezuma, because I do think that he was traumatized severely by his abduction, that holding on, holding on to that umbilical cord, if you will, to his maternal community, provided him some solace. And so that name that he held on to was Saja. I mean, that was powerful medicine. It's probably something he couldn't explain to others without sounding odd.
Right, right.
But that name was medicine for him.
Yeah. Along while we're still talking about politics, one of the things that's mentioned many times is his 1915 speech, "Let My People Go," and that again, that was him talking about the BIA, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and this was a speech to the Society of American Indians, which was a society that he was a part of, but he has at this point he has kind of grown, I guess, frustrated with that society as well, and their power, or the power that they don't have, and that they are not in cahoots, but I'm trying to say that they weren't. They were actually in the pockets of BIA, I guess, or something like that. It was the way it was kind of. Can you talk about that speech, and then and also the Society of Indian Archivists, or Society of American Indians?
Oh, sure. Oh,
Let's
sure.
talk about archivists.
Yeah, the SAI, the Society of American Indians, it was conceived, as an Indian rights organization run by Indian people. And so depending on who you talk to, and the original generation of that group, whether it's Montezuma, whether it's Charles Eastman, whether it's Arthur Parker, you're going to get a different take on what the goal is of that organization, what Indian rights are, that they're defending. In the case of Montezuma, as far as he was concerned, that there was no good in maintaining any kind of relationship with the Indian office. And he held that opinion because as of when the SAI was formed, it had its first meeting in 1911. The speech you referred to, "Let My People Go," is 1915. So Fort McDowell had already undergone the situation where they were struggling to protect their land and water rights. They wanted to stay in Fort McDowell. The Indian office, as of 1910, 1911, had this plan that in order to open up their territory to economic development, that they were going to move the Yavapai down to Salt River. So in 1911, Montezuma went with the delegation, Yavapai delegation, to DC to argue their case. And they argued vehemently and they argued convincingly. And so the Department of Interior at that time reversed the decision, right? What happens, and this is familiar politics, America has an election, they put in a new president from the opposite party who staffs his cabinet with people who support his agenda. And so that's when Cato Sells appears. It's under Wilson. So by the time Montezuma delivers that speech, Cato Sells has already made up his mind that, no, we're going to resume this plan to remove the Yavapai down to Salt River. So that struggle is already going on back home. So with respect to the SAI, to answer your question more directly, Montezuma had a huge issue with a number of Indian Bureau Indians that were going to be recruited as members of the SAI. As far as Montezuma was concerned, any Indian working for the Bureau was betraying their people.
Right.
Period. And so, unsurprisingly, Montezuma's assessment of the SAI and this agenda of protecting our rights is that it was a huge failure. So that's why in the speech, when you read it, he's ridiculing them. Like, all they do is get together and talk and shake hands and make speeches, pass resolutions, blah, 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 but they don't do anything for Indian people. How do you know? Well, I've worked for 3 different reservations. I'm an Indian doctor. This is what I've seen firsthand. And this is what I'm still hearing, not only from my community, but from other communities, that all of the chronic problems that the Indian Bureau is supposed to address, because they're our protector that's supposed to be working for us, are not only ongoing, but they're getting worse from year to year.
Right.
And so when it comes to the SAI, what are they doing? They're just, let's plan our meeting in Denver next year. They're not doing anything. And so Montezuma's like, yeah, we all got to band together. We all have this common problem, the Indian Bureau. But, you got to do something. Something, anything. Even if you don't have any money, you still got to do something. Write letters. Make a lot of noise.
Right.
Don't make excuses for the Bureau.
Yeah. And that speech did make a lot of noise. And it's, not only for Arizona, but for other areas as well. Was he, there was a period of time after his death was he a forgotten hero for a while in Arizona?
Depends on who you talk to, and anything in history depends on context. His family and his tribe never forgot him. And ever since his passing, they've been honoring him, as a revered ancestor. With respect to Arizona, or America, or the American Indian community in general, he did become a forgotten figure. In fact, that whole generation became a forgotten generation. And so when the Ret Power movement arises some 50 years later, 40, 50 years later, what people didn't realize when Ret Power generation was organizing is that they were part of a tradition in Indian rights advocacy, that they had predecessors, that they had ancestors in Montezuma's generation as well. And so it's been a slow but steady, positive process of remembering these ancestors. And so Montezuma's status, say in American Indian Studies, what it was, say in the 80s when I started becoming aware of these things as a student, has changed substantially. It's 180 degrees to where it is today, where books are being published, interviews are being had, and all this media attention
Right.
is occurring. People are talking about him again.
Wow. Yeah. You mentioned family, and a big part of this book, besides his political advocacy, is his connections with his family, his Yavapai family, as he's
Right.
in Illinois and they are here. And the correspondence with the family. Was there anything surprising that you discovered in going through all those papers, going through those letters from his family members who affectionately call him cousin in a lot of
Yeah.
these letters, and kind
Yeah.
of did you learn something new about this relationship that he had later on in his life?
Well, when you read Montezuma's writing, especially the Wasaja newsletter, which was his primary medium for documenting his thoughts and opinions, um, you might not get the impression that he had a substantial relationship with his family. They do come up,
Mhm.
but what the correspondence reveals is the depth of this relationship, that he had a sibling-like relationship with all of his cousins. That they just easily regarded him, as being a member of the family, being a member of the community. He was never criticized or given any grief for living in Chicago, for being a doctor, and
Mhm.
certainly wealthier than anyone back home. you know, uh, there is this regard for him, that because he remembers where he's from, because he's working so hard for us, that there's no reason not to regard him, as a valued member of the community. And so what I learned from reading those letters is how much his relationship to his family, what he heard from them regularly, informed his political agenda. And so
Right.
when you read those letters and then you read that speech, "Let my people go,"
Mhm.
all of a sudden you see his family and community in everything that he's talking about, even though he does not mention Fort McDowell or Yavapai once in that speech.
Right. Right. He had a perspective. He lived in both. He lived in two worlds. And
Right.
so he had a perspective. I think that um, helped in his advocacy and communication
Mhm.
that was different. One of the family members, as I was reading your book, I was Mike Burns,
Right.
who was a cousin of his, had almost as tragic a story, incredible story about him and the being involved and in the Skeleton Cave massacre, and then it was to see his correspondence with Montezuma and the back and forth. I thought that was it. Can you talk about that family member of his?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, he's not without controversy
Mhm.
in Yavapai history. Um, Although he was a little boy when this occurred,
It was 7, I
eh,
think, right?
7, 8 years
Yeah,
old, really, really
yeah.
young, really, really young. He was blamed for leading American troops to where his family, his community was hiding out, because the troops were coming in, and, they were targeting civilians, old people, women, and children, and it was all for the purpose of rounding Apaches up to force them into the reservation system, most importantly at San Carlos.
Mhm.
And so this white army officer befriended this little boy, and so basically tricked him
Mhm.
into divulging this information, thinking that this man was a friend. But of course, he wasn't. He was an officer in the field with orders to round up Apaches. And so the result was that massacre, which he had to carry with him his whole life. And that was in addition to, although he was raised in the white officer's family and learned how to read and write English, he
Right.
returned home permanently at a young age too, where he was scorned for his legacy, in the Skeleton Cave massacre. But at the same time, he is credited with writing a history of Fort McDowell, which unfortunately he did not publish during his lifetime. But nonetheless, he was one of these early important examples of Native history writing. And so he was an intellectual in his own right. But alas, he did not publish anything. And so that's probably true of a lot of people out there, because the thing about our communities, we don't historically generate a lot of college graduates. There's not a lot of PhDs in history out there. And so we have to do things on our own. We have to figure it out on our own. And so it's commonplace to see quote unquote amateur historians, working out there today, working historically, who have these manuscripts in their drawer that hopefully somebody will recover, like Mike Burns, and publish. But there's probably a lot of them that have yet to be rediscovered.
Right. So this book, you also wrote a book about George Eastman.
Charles.
And I'm sorry, yes, Charles. And can you talk about the similarity? Both of them had kind of a public perception that your research kind of shows a different side to.
Yeah, as a contemporary, Eastman was subject to the same developments in federal Indian policy, including a tribe that had to deal with the invasion of American troops. Montezuma. Eastman is also a child of trauma. He was a little boy during the 1862 U.S. Dakota War, which resulted in the largest mass hanging in the United States, when the Dakota 38 were hanged on December 26th, 1862. Eastman's a product of Western schooling, from going to Indian boarding school in Santee all the way to his graduation from Dartmouth, and then going to the Boston Medical College. And so as a result of that background, Eastman historically had a reputation for being an assimilated Indian as well. And so that's also a peculiar perception of Montezuma. It's like when people see Indian people dressed in jacket and tie, that especially when they're from 100 years ago, there's this assumption that they gladly and willingly assimilated into white society, became professionals like doctors, and just kind of forgot about who they are as Indian people. The objective of that book on Eastman, Dakota Philosopher, was to demonstrate how much Eastman retained of his Dakota identity. So in Eastman's case, of course, he still spoke his language. He spoke it fluently. He knew Dakota oral tradition. He knew the U.S. Dakota War from the Dakota point of view, and the impact that American Indian federal Indian policy had on Indian people, whether it's Dakota or whether it's Lakota out at Pine Ridge. He was the government doctor when the Wounded Knee Massacre happened. And so Eastman, like Montezuma, became a critic, a very vocal critic of federal Indian policy, because that same policy has resulted in these disasters for the community. So obviously the civilization agenda as it's being enacted, it is simply not working.
Right. Very similar situations. Looks like my last question, and before we move to the next step. So is there anything that we haven't talked about? Is there something that's an important thing about Dr. Carlos Montezuma that you would like people to know that maybe you discovered in your research or in your, in your 20 years of research that you want to make sure that people do know about him?
Well, one of the things that came up in my research, and this was when I was doing research into what had been written about him before, there was this very interesting references to Montezuma as having this what Ed Spicer called a spiritual influence on Indian people. This is where you see reference to Indians on the reservation organizing into groups called the Montezumas.
Right, okay.
And in the case of the Thono O'odham, then called the Papago, one of these groups developed. And it's an interesting example because they seem to have a relationship, the Montezumas, with the League of Papago Chiefs. If you know it, I'm sure you all know Papago history, right? If you read about Thono O'odham history during this epoch, early 1900s, you'll see reference to the League of Papago Chiefs. What distinguished that group is that most of them did not go to boarding school. They maintained a close affiliation with Thono O'odham tradition, and they believed that the Thono O'odham should be allowed to govern themselves, and subject themselves less to Indian Bureau control. So they were traditionalists, to put it simply. Yet, despite Montezuma's basically assimilationist agenda, he wanted Indians to get educated, become professionals, show white America what an Indian can do. He didn't have that side to him. Nonetheless, because what the people in Arizona, the Indian people in Arizona, knew Montezuma for was standing up to the Indian Bureau and asserting your rights. Montezuma, for that generation of Indian people, whether it's Yavapai or Pima or Papago, he was the first Indian that anyone ever heard of that had the audacity to call the Indian service racist. And people had never seen that before.
Right.
That's how they felt. But Montezuma set this very brave example where he was willing to speak truth to power in a way that they hadn't seen before. Wow. And so it was because of that vigilance, that warrior spirit, if you will, that he inspired people on the reservation who identify with their traditions, that we got to stand up and speak for ourselves too.
Right. Very inspirational. Okay, I see Vina. So we are going to the next part, and she's going to take over. Vina, you there?
Yes, I'm here.
All right.
Hi, David.
Hi.
I really enjoyed your book.
Thank you.
And I wanted to bring you back on, we talked a lot, you mentioned about your research and in the discussion of documents, right? So and we talked a lot about kinship, and a lot of your material reference a lot of those archival materials. I wanted to see can you describe your research process in terms of your interaction with the archival materials, and also, as Native people, we have such a strong connection to land and water, and a lot of your materials focuses on land and water. So now that we're dealing with so much that we have lost, and a lot of these stories are told in a documented form, how did that archival connect you in that way towards what was described in these archival materials associated with the land and water?
Okay. Well, when readers look at this particular book, I hope that what they appreciate is how much of those ancestor voices, are part of my narrative. In each one of the chapters that make up this book, you'll see these lengthy quotes from those letters. And I did very little to nothing to alter the way that these ancestors wrote. And so that included, their broken English, quote unquote, their peculiar use of punctuation, and very, very unique writing styles. And so I wanted all of that in there because for anyone familiar with any reservation community, they know that we have our own way of talking, even when we're talking in English. There are just ways that when you're part of the community, you recognize these figures of speech, and you can recognize the cadence of the voice even when it's written down. And so when they talk about the letter writers talk about life at home, I describe it as salt of the earth, and they really are, because there's no pretension at all in how they describe their daily lives, whether it's working their fields, whether it's dealing with the Indian agent, whether it's having to find temporary work, during the off season. So maybe they go into, there's some references to going into Scottsdale or Mesa, not to shop, but they were picking cotton. So they had to do, wage labor like that. And so the way that they talk about their lives gives you a unique perspective on how people at home, well, this particular home, were experiencing the kind of things like assimilation that we talk about, say, in a college class. And maybe we make reference to the 1887 general allotment policy. Maybe we'll read the statute together to see what it says, what its goals are. But reading that statute is one thing. Reading those letters is another, because then you get to see how this is actually happening in real people's lives. And so they don't talk much about law and policy. That's not really their concern. What their concern is that, well, basically, America can do what it wants, that Congress can pass all the laws that it wants. But as long as I can grow my fields, as long as I have enough water, as long as I can feed my family, as long as I can access the places that we've always accessed, without having to fear the Indian agent coming in and arresting me, then that's all that I need. And so that's something that I hope that comes through in this book, because when it comes to talking about our land and water rights, it's like you really need to see what the people have to say about that land, and their water, in order to appreciate why these things are important.
Yeah, and I think Archive does a really great job in, discussing all of those times.
Yeah.
And your book also addressed a lot of those, his correspondence, right? When you were interacting with the correspondence in the archival materials, did any of your perception changed about Dr. Montezuma, during that process of research, and his view of history, or your view of history?
Yeah, well, he's I think he became a more complicated figure for me, because when say I teach Let My People Go, if you only read that particular speech, you might think, as a teacher or a scholar, that Montezuma's political agenda is pretty easy to figure out. He regards the Indian Office as being a failed federal agency. He has admiration for other Indians who have succeeded in the white man's world. He gives this list of people that become doctors and teachers and so on. And so you think, well, this is what he's all about. He just wants better access for Indian people into the white man's world. But when you read those letters, you begin to realize that what may be motivating him to advocate for better access, into the white man's world is not because the white man's world is better than the Indian world, but maybe if Indian people can access that world, maybe they can evade all of the abuses and hostility that the Indian Bureau is inflicting on us at home. And
Yeah.
so I think that his plan was really, how do we diffuse, all of this trauma that this federal agency is causing us? We need more freedom. We need more options. Whether people want to move off the reservation, actually, that should be their choice.
Yeah.
But the Indian Bureau that we're stuck with back then said, no, you can't move anywhere. You have to stay here and deal with us.
Yeah. You had mentioned that he didn't experience a whole lot of trauma with boarding school, right? There was also mention in your book about the Phoenix Indian School, there was talks about that. Do you think how based on your research, was there any like comments of his remarks about some of the Phoenix Indian School that occurred here that while he was corresponding with his relatives or anything like that?
Well, it's in his relatives' correspondence where get these anecdotes about the Phoenix Indian School, abusing kids. And there was even some complicity between the head of Phoenix Indian School, I forgot his name now, some white guy, and some people working in the res. There was two outsiders that were working for the Indian Bureau. I think they were Plains Indians, not to disparage our Plains cousins, but this couple was working with the head of the Indian school for the sake of abducting children. And so Montezuma's relatives were telling him about this. This is what these people are doing. I think Montezuma was outraged by this abuse, but what I didn't see, and I'm not sure if this is a criticism of Montezuma or not, what I didn't see in Montezuma's writings is any meaningful reaction to those anecdotes, because he was a strong proponent of modern education for Indian people. So I'm not sure how he reconciled this. Maybe he wasn't able to reconcile what he was hearing from his family about places like Phoenix Indian School and his advocacy for modern education for Indian people. Okay. So that's a contradiction that remains a contradiction.
Yeah. Yeah, you wish you could have all of those information, connect the dots. In archives, it's so choppy in that narration. Right. For the last question, he was totally against the Bureau of Indian Affairs, right? Now we have seen a change in shift. What would you say that his view on right now with the Bureau of Indian Affairs being run by Indigenous people now?
I would think that he would still say, watch your back. Insofar as we're talking about, very powerful, federal agency, the Indian Bureau today, while I don't want to unnecessarily criticize our brothers and sisters that are working for them now, it is still beholden to the federal government. So ultimately, what the Indian Bureau does today, 2024, is still influenced by what the President of the United States sets as the agenda for Interior and in turn for Indian affairs. And so I'm sure that if we were to talk to our elders and our community leaders today, that they would easily be able to enumerate the issues that are still having with the federal government. And so I would think that Montezuma would still like to see the eliminate. If he was around today, he would still like to see the elimination of that agency.
Yeah. So we have a couple minutes. I wanted to talk a little bit of Labriola to our audience. Right. A lot of the materials that David Martinez mentioned about in the archival materials that he has written about his book is also in Labriola. And I want to talk a little bit about it and how his collection aligns with Labriola's mission. Can you see all my presentation slides?
Yes.
Awesome. So I'm going to briefly talk about it and where you could find these archival materials in your own home. You could search them out. But I do want to mention that Labriola, Carlos Montezuma's history and language provides such an accurate information from an Indigenous perspective. And so what Labriola does here at with ASU is we highlight a lot of Indigenous librarianship and archives, in which we promote a lot of our cultural identity, history, and language, along with our cultural survival that is also really evident in a lot of Carlos Montezuma's initiative and advocacy, and also enforcing a lot of our cultural values. As Joyce mentioned, with our land acknowledgement statements, we really influence a lot of that Indigenous knowledge system into our practices. Also, a lot of these practices lead to for healing for our community, for historical trauma, and a lot of those things that we face with the Bureau of Indian Affairs, a lot of these policies, particularly with a lot of our land and water rights. So as you can see there, we are an Indigenous-led library. We have our little shiny faces here. We have, if you come to our spaces at Labriola, you may come at a time with a fry bread or a blue corn muffin. Come at a right time, we may have some of that. And also, this is our mission statement. I'm not going to go into depth. You can also find this at the our website here. Details a lot of our mission, dealing with programming, collection, and stewardship, working with tribal nations. And then also our value system, that is what we discussed a lot with David Martinez, is about kinship, community, and consent, and particularly sovereignty, with a lot of those land and water rights documentation that we see in archives. And also just to note that archive, we also have Carlos Montezuma's collection, but we also have a lot of prolific leaders. Jean Shahardry, she did a lot with the Phoenix Indian School. Peterson Zaw done a lot for ASU students here and also for his tribal community. Simon Ortiz is a very prolific writer. We also have Trudy Jackson, that has who is a transgender woman that ran for presidency. Along with Labriola's collection, we do have tribal newspapers, ephemera, and distinctive collection that has a lot of language books and publications from different tribal nations. And if you are wanting to know more about the Carlos Montezuma collection and interact with them at your home, you can log on to this repository link here and then click on the prism. And then once you do prism, click on there, type on Carlos Montezuma, and it will give you various archival materials that has been digitized. A lot of the books that David has referenced are also in here. So, and I will pass it back to Joyce.
Thank you, Vina, and thank you, everyone. The ASU Library would like to extend a huge thank you to David Martinez, Brad Vogus, and Vina Begay for bringing their energy, enthusiasm, expertise to today's events. We would also like to thank you all for attending today. Today's event has been recorded and will be available on the ASU Library YouTube channel. The audience members will all receive a post-event survey, and we would appreciate it if you could take a couple minutes to share your thoughts with us. And thank you to all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.